I was 2 hours into walking along Route 93 when I realized no one was going to stop. The Nevada desert stretched out endlessly in every direction, the horizon shimmering with heat. Cars passed by every few minutes, but not one slowed down. To be fair, I probably wouldn't have stopped for me either. A guy in his mid-20s, dusty jeans, a backpack slung over one shoulder, and no real explanation for why he was out there. I was starting to think I'd be walking forever when I heard it. The rumble of an engine slowing down. I turned to see an old pickup truck pulling to the side of the road, its paint faded and chipped. The driver rolled down the passenger window, a grin plastered across his face. "You need a ride, friend?" he asked, his voice warm and casual. I hesitated for a moment, but the sun beating down on me left little room for second-guessing. "Yeah, thanks," I said, climbing into the truck. The air inside was cooler than I expected, the faint smell of cigarettes lingering. The driver looked like he was in his late 40s or early 50s, with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. "Where you headed?" he asked, shifting the truck back onto the road. "Just trying to get to Reno," I replied, settling into the worn leather seat. He nodded, his hands steady on the wheel. "Well, I'm headed up that way. Name's Carl." "Josh," I said, giving him a small nod. Carl's grin widened. "Well, Josh, looks like we've got some road ahead of us. Hope you don't mind some company." The first hour passed easily enough. Carl was chatty, telling me about his job hauling scrap metal and his love of old country music, which played softly from the truck's radio. He had a way of talking that put me at ease, his voice low and friendly. For a while, I forgot about the blistering heat outside or the fact that I didn't have much of a plan once I got to Reno. But then the questions started. "So, Josh, what's got you out here hitchhiking? Trouble back home?" "Not really," I said, shrugging. "Just needed a change of scenery." He chuckled, the sound low and gravelly. "Yeah, I get that. Sometimes you just gotta leave everything behind, right?" There was something in the way he said it that made me pause. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. His hands were still steady on the wheel, but his knuckles were white, gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. "You ever think about how easy it is?" he continued, his tone casual. "How easy what is?" I asked. "To just disappear," he said, glancing at me with that same grin. "Leave everything behind. No one really knows where you went, no one asks too many questions. You ever think about that?" The question hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. "I guess not," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. Carl nodded, his grin fading as he stared back at the road. "Yeah," he said quietly, "not everyone gets it." The conversation shifted after that, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. The sun was beginning to set, painting the desert in hues of orange and red, when Carl turned off the main road. "We're taking a shortcut," he said, his grin back in place. The dirt road was narrow and uneven, winding through rocky hills and clusters of scrub brush. I stared out the window, the unease in my chest growing with every mile. "Are you sure this goes to Reno?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Relax," Carl said, laughing. "I've driven this road 100 times. Trust me." I wanted to believe him, but something about the way he kept glancing at me made my stomach churn. And then I saw it, something glinting in the rearview mirror. It was faint, but unmistakable. A pair of handcuffs hanging from the back of the cab. My heart started pounding. "Hey, Carl," I said, trying to sound casual. "Mind if we pull over for a second? I need to use the bathroom." He didn't respond at first, his grip tightening on the wheel. Finally, he nodded. "Sure thing, Josh." The truck slowed to a stop, kicking up a cloud of dust. I climbed out, my legs shaky, and walked a few steps away from the truck. The desert was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the engine behind me. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. Should I run? Call for help? Before I could decide, I heard the crunch of boots on gravel. I turned to see Carl standing a few feet away, his grin gone. In his hand was a tire iron. "Something wrong, Josh?" he asked, his voice low and calm. My pulse was racing, my throat dry. "No," I said quickly. Just needed some air. Carl nodded, taking a slow step closer. Funny thing, he said, his eyes narrowing. I think you're lying. And just like that, the uneasy calm shattered. Carl's grin returned, but it wasn't friendly anymore. It was sharp, predatory, and filled with something I couldn't quite place. Something that made my stomach drop. We've got a long night ahead of us, he said softly, and I knew in that moment that getting into his truck was the worst mistake of my life. The first swing of the tire iron came so fast, I barely had time to react. Carl wasn't aiming for me, at least not yet. The metal struck the side of the truck with a loud clang, reverberating through the silent desert. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. Don't make this harder than it has to be, Carl said, his voice calm but laced with menace. The tire iron dangled loosely in his hand, but his grip was firm. He took a slow step forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. Just get back in the truck. My instincts screamed at me to fight, to do anything but comply. But the way Carl looked at me, his eyes unblinking, his posture too relaxed, told me he wasn't bluffing. He'd use that tire iron if I gave him a reason. Okay, I said, raising my hands. Okay, man, just take it easy. Carl's grin returned, and he nodded, motioning toward the truck with the tire iron. Smart kid. Get in. I turned slowly, my mind racing. Every step back toward the truck felt like a step closer to my own grave. As I reached the passenger door, I caught sight of something in the corner of my eye. On the ground, partially obscured by the dust, was a length of chain. Heavy, rusted, and coiled like a snake. I didn't think, I just grabbed it. Spinning around, I swung the chain with everything I had. It caught Carl across the forearm, the impact making him grunt as the tire iron clattered to the ground. Damn it, kid, he snarled, clutching his arm. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I ran. The desert stretched out before me, endless and unforgiving. My legs burned as I sprinted across the uneven ground, the sound of Carl's boots pounding behind me. Where you gonna go, Josh? He shouted, his voice carrying over the empty landscape. There's nothing out here but sand and rocks. He was right, and that was the worst part. The nearest town was miles away, and the sun had long since dipped below the horizon. The darkness swallowed everything, leaving only the faint glow of the stars to light my path. But I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Carl was fast. Too fast for a man his size. I could hear him gaining on me, his breath labored but determined. And then I tripped. My foot caught on something. Maybe a rock, maybe my own exhaustion, and I hit the ground hard. Pain shot through my palms and knees as I scrambled to get up, but it was too late. Carl was on me. He tackled me to the ground, his weight pressing down on my back as he forced me into the dirt. You should have just gotten back in the truck, he hissed, his breath hot against my ear. I struggled, kicking and clawing, but he was too strong. With one hand, he grabbed the chain I dropped and looped it around my wrists, yanking it tight. The rusted metal bit into my skin, the pain sharp and immediate. There, Carl said, sitting back to admire his handiwork. That wasn't so hard, was it? I was breathing hard, my chest heaving as I glared up at him. You're insane, I spat. Carl chuckled, wiping the sweat from his brow. You're not the first to say that, he admitted, his grin widening. And if you don't shut up, you won't be the last. He dragged me back toward the truck, the chain digging into my wrists as I stumbled behind him. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest, but Carl didn't care. He was humming now, some old country tune I didn't recognize, like he was enjoying himself. When we reached the truck, he shoved me into the passenger seat and slammed the door shut. He climbed into the driver's side, his movements calm and deliberate, like this was just another day at work. As the truck rumbled to life, Carl glanced over at me, his grin still in place. Here's how this is gonna work, he said, his tone conversational. You're gonna sit there, nice and quiet, and I'm gonna take care of some business. Business? I asked, my voice shaking. Carl nodded, his eyes fixed on the road. Gotta make a stop before Reno. Don't worry, you'll like it. Real scenic. I didn't believe him for a second. My wrists throbbed against the chains as I struggled to keep calm, my mind racing for a way out. But Carl wasn't just driving anymore. He was whistling, a slow, eerie tune that sent chills down my spine. After what felt like hours, the truck turned off the dirt road and onto another narrow path. The headlights illuminated a small cabin in the distance, its windows dark and foreboding. Carl killed the engine, turning to me with a look that made my blood run cold. "Welcome home," he said softly, and then he reached under his seat, pulling out a roll of duct tape. The cabin loomed ahead, its shadow stretching across the barren desert. Whatever Carl had planned, I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't leave that place the same person I was when I arrived, if I left at all. The cabin was smaller than it had looked from a distance. Up close, I could see the warped wood of the walls, the broken shingles on the roof, and the faint smell of decay wafting from inside. Carl pulled me out of the truck with a firm yank, the chain around my wrists digging deeper into my skin. He didn't say a word as he dragged me toward the door. When he pushed it open, I froze. The inside was worse than I could have imagined. The cabin was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. The walls were covered in newspaper clippings, photographs, and hand-drawn maps. Some of the pictures were of people. Men, women, even children. Each one marked with a red X. A table in the center of the room was littered with tools. Hammers, pliers, knives of various sizes. Some of them were stained dark, the metal rusted and worn from use. My stomach churned as I caught sight of a rope coiled neatly in the corner and a heavy padlock lying beside it. Carl shoved me into a wooden chair, securing my legs with duct tape before stepping back to admire his work. "You're lucky, you know," he said, his grin wider than ever. "Most people don't make it this far. Usually, they give me a reason to take care of him before we get here." I glared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound defiant. Carl chuckled, scratching his scruffy beard as he paced the room. "It ain't about what I want, kid. It's about teaching people a lesson." "A lesson?" Carl nodded, his expression turning serious. "You kids these days, you don't get it. You think the world owes you something. Think you're invincible. But out here," he gestured around the cabin, his eyes glinting, "out here you're just meat. Same as everyone else." He turned back to the table, picking up a large hunting knife and testing its edge against his thumb. The blade glinted under the weak light, its sharpness sending a shiver down my spine. "See this?" he said, holding the knife up for me to see. "This here's what keeps the world in check. Balance. One cut at a time." I struggled against the tape, my pulse racing as Carl walked toward me. "Let me go," I said, my voice cracking. "You don't have to do this." Carl crouched in front of me, his grin returning as he leaned in close. "But I do, Josh. I really, really do." The blade hovered near my face, the cold metal sending goosebumps across my skin. I clenched my jaw, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me panic. But Carl's grin faltered. He lowered the knife, tilting his head as he studied me. "You're different," he muttered. "Most people beg by now, cry, scream. But you're quiet." I didn't answer. Instead, I focused on the chain around my wrists, twisting it subtly, testing its strength. The rusted links creaked softly, the sound drowned out by Carl's muttering. He stood abruptly, turning away to rummage through the cluttered table. "You know," he said, his tone almost conversational, "I wasn't even planning on stopping for you, but something about you just called to me." I worked the chain harder, the sharp edges cutting into my skin as I twisted and pulled. Carl was distracted, his back to me as he inspected a pair of pliers. This was my chance. With one final, desperate pull, the chain snapped. The sound was loud enough to make Carl spin around, his eyes narrowing as he saw me lunge toward him. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the first thing I could, an old wrench lying on the edge of the table, and swung it with everything I had. The metal connected with Carl's temple, the impact sending him staggering backward. He let out a guttural roar, his hand flying to his head as blood trickled down his face. "You little—" I didn't let him finish. I swung again, this time aiming for his arm. The wrench hit with a sickening crack, and Carl dropped the knife, cursing loudly. Adrenaline coursed through me as I stumbled toward the door, my hands still raw and bleeding from the chain. Carl was already getting back to his feet, his movements slower now but no less dangerous. "You're not getting out of here!" he shouted, his voice filled with rage. I didn't look back. I burst through the door, the cold night air hitting me like a slap to the face. The desert stretched out before me, vast and empty. But I didn't care. I ran, the sound of Carl's footsteps close behind me. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but I pushed forward, my eyes scanning the horizon for anything, anywhere to hide. Up ahead, I saw it, a cluster of rocks jutting out of the sand. I veered toward them, ducking behind the largest one just as Carl's footsteps grew louder. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my ears as I pressed myself against the cold stone. "Come on, Josh," Carl called out, his voice echoing through the night. "You think you can run forever? You think anyone's gonna find you out here?" The sound of his boots grew fainter as he moved further away, searching the darkness. I stayed hidden, my body trembling, my mind racing with a single thought. I had to survive. And if Carl found me again, I wouldn't hold back. The cabin was far behind me, but Carl's voice lingered in my mind. The desert was vast, but I knew he was still out there. And this wasn't over. I don't know how long I crouched behind those rocks, trying to steady my breathing. The desert was deathly quiet now, with only the faint rustle of the wind to keep me company. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound a threat. Carl was out there, I knew it, and he wasn't the type to give up easily. When I finally worked up the courage to move, the adrenaline that had carried me this far was gone. My legs shook as I stood, and my wrists ached from the chain that had bitten into them earlier. But I couldn't stay here. If Carl came back and found me, I wouldn't get another chance. I started walking, sticking close to the rocks to stay out of sight. The cold night air was a sharp contrast to the heat of the day, biting through my thin shirt and making me shiver. I had no idea where I was going, but anywhere was better than here. After what felt like hours, I spotted something in the distance. A faint glow, just over the horizon. It could have been anything. A fire, a car's headlights, maybe even a town. It didn't matter. It was hope. I moved faster, stumbling over rocks and loose sand as the glow grew brighter. My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears as I crested a small hill and saw it. A gas station. The building was old and run down, its neon sign flickering weakly in the darkness. But it was real, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a sliver of relief. I ran to the door, my hand trembling as I pushed it open. The bell above the entrance jingled, and a bored-looking cashier glanced up from behind the counter. "Help you?" he asked, his voice monotone. "I need a phone," I said, my voice hoarse. The cashier frowned, eyeing me warily. "You okay, man? You look like you've been through hell." "I just need a phone," I repeated, my desperation clear. He gestured toward the back wall. "Payphone's outside. Quarter to use it." I didn't have a quarter, but before I could argue, the door burst open behind me, slamming against the wall with a deafening bang. Carl. His face was streaked with dried blood, his eyes wild and furious. "There you are," he growled, stepping inside. The cashier froze, his eyes darting between us. "Hey, what the hell is going on?" he demanded. Carl ignored him, his focus entirely on me. "You've been real annoying, Josh. I gave you a chance to do this the easy way, and you blew it." The cashier reached under the counter, his hand coming up with a shotgun. "Both of you out," he barked, his voice shaking. Carl laughed, a low, menacing sound that sent chills down my spine. "You think that's gonna stop me?" he asked, taking a step closer. Before I could react, Carl lunged. He grabbed the barrel of the shotgun, yanking it upward as the cashier pulled the trigger. The blast echoed through the small store, the bullet tearing a hole in the ceiling. The two of them struggled, the cashier shouting as Carl wrenched the gun from his hands. "Run!" the cashier yelled, his voice desperate. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted out the door, my feet pounding against the pavement as I ran toward the highway. Behind me, I heard another gunshot, followed by a heavy thud. I didn't look back. The road stretched out before me, empty and endless. I ran until my lungs burned, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the sound of Carl's voice in my head. "You think you can run forever?" Up ahead, I saw headlights approaching. A car. I stumbled into the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically. The car slowed, its tires screeching slightly as it came to a stop. The driver, a middle-aged man with a worried expression, rolled down his window. "You okay, kid?" "Please," I gasped. "I need help. There's a man. He's trying to kill me." The driver's eyes widened, and he nodded quickly. "Get in." I climbed into the car, my hands shaking as I slammed the door behind me. The driver pulled back onto the road, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "What's going on?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. I think he's been following me." The driver nodded, his grip tightening on the wheel. "Don't worry. We'll get you to the police." For a moment, I thought I was safe. But then I saw it. In the mirror, headlights, far behind us, but unmistakably there. Carl's truck. "Faster," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The driver glanced at me, confusion flashing across his face. "What? Go faster," I shouted. The truck behind us grew closer, its engine roaring as it closed the distance. "Hang on," the driver yelled, slamming his foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, the speedometer climbing as the truck loomed larger in the mirror. Carl wasn't giving up, and neither was I. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, but Carl was relentless. No matter how fast we went, I could feel him closing in. And I knew the nightmare was far from over. The car skidded along the dirt road, the headlights bouncing wildly as the driver struggled to keep control. Carl's truck was relentless, its massive frame bearing down on us, getting closer with each passing second. "Hold on," the driver shouted, jerking the wheel hard to the left. The car lurched, and I gripped the door handle tightly as the truck slammed into us from behind. The impact threw me forward, the seatbelt cutting into my chest. The truck rammed us again, harder this time, sending us spinning off the road. The car plowed into a rocky ditch and came to a jarring stop. My head hit the window, stars exploding in my vision as the engine sputtered and died. "Out!" the driver yelled, already fumbling with his door. I followed, stumbling into the cold night air, my legs shaking beneath me. Carl's truck roared to a halt a few yards away, the high beams flooding the desert around us with harsh white light. "Run!" the driver shouted, pulling me toward a cluster of boulders in the distance. We scrambled over the uneven terrain, the sound of Carl's boots crunching on the gravel not far behind us. I dared a glance back and saw him, a dark silhouette against the glow of his truck's headlights. He wasn't running. He didn't need to. We reached the rocks and crouched low, our breathing loud and ragged in the silence. The driver pulled out his phone, his hands trembling as he tried to dial 911. "No signal," he muttered, his voice shaking. The crunch of gravel grew louder. Carl was close now, his shadow stretching long and menacing in the dim light. The driver gestured for me to stay low, then grabbed a jagged rock from the ground. "I'll distract him," he whispered. "Wait," I hissed, grabbing his arm. But it was too late. The driver stepped out from behind the boulder, holding the rock like a weapon. "Hey!" he shouted. Carl stopped, tilting his head like a curious dog. "You want me, you psycho? Come and get me," the driver taunted. For a moment, Carl didn't move. Then, with a low chuckle, he started walking. The driver threw the rock, the jagged edge striking Carl's shoulder. It barely slowed him down. "Run, kid!" the driver shouted, his voice cracking with panic. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to move, to help, to do something. But my body wouldn't obey. Carl closed the distance in seconds, the glint of a crowbar catching the light as he raised it high. The sound of the impact echoed through the night. I turned away, bile rising in my throat as the driver collapsed to the ground. Carl stood over him, his chest rising and falling heavily, the crowbar slick with blood. He looked up, his eyes locking onto mine. "Your turn, Josh," he said softly, his voice carrying easily over the stillness. I ran. The rocks tore at my hands and knees as I scrambled over them, the sound of Carl's boots following close behind. The desert stretched out before me, endless and unforgiving. Every step felt heavier, every breath harder to draw. But I didn't stop. Couldn't. Up ahead I saw it. A faint light in the distance, flickering like a mirage. I sprinted toward it, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. As I got closer, the light became clearer. A pair of headlights, parked at the edge of the highway. "Help!" I screamed, waving my arms frantically. The headlights flared as the car's engine roared to life. It was a police cruiser. The officers jumped out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as I collapsed to my knees in front of them. "There's a man," I gasped. He killed someone. He's still out there." The officers didn't waste time. They grabbed their weapons and moved toward the rocks, their voices sharp and commanding as they called out. But the desert was silent. They found the driver first. He was still breathing, though barely, his face pale and bloodied. But Carl was gone. The officers combed the area for hours, their flashlights sweeping over every rock and crevice. They found the crowbar, the bloodied weapon abandoned near the edge of the clearing. But there was no sign of Carl. It was like he had vanished into thin air. The driver was taken to the hospital, his injuries severe but not fatal. I gave the police my statement, my hands still trembling as I recounted everything that had happened. But as the sun rose over the desert, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Carl was still out there, and he wouldn't stop until he found someone else. I don't hitchhike anymore. I don't even drive at night if I can help it, because every time I close my eyes, I see him, the grin, the crowbar, the promise in his voice when he said, "Your turn," and I know one day he'll come back for me.